Thank you, Lisa. It's so important for all of us to hear from those who are doing the work in communities across the country and across the world. And I think, that's one of the threads that keeps coming up. How do we address global issues within a local context? And it's the only way we can make change is if individually we make change. So all of us have that responsibility. And again, thank you for your words today. So I'm here to introduce a focus panel session. It's a series of conversations and presentations on confronting the environmental crisis that we face as people, as humans on this planet. And when we put out the call for this conference under the theme of sustainability and revitalization, we received many responses to that call, as you've seen over the past few days, taking different approaches to what it means to be sustainable, to be relevant in our communities. And when I was, as president of the board, looking at the proposals and thinking about how we would have this conference these past few days, I thought, well, we really need something to focus on this existential threat of climate. And so we organized this focus session. And it's a multi-part program. So we'll begin with a presentation. I'll talk more in a second. We're going to then present a panel conversation with a group of curators, a conservator, collections people, and talk about what's happening in various fields that affect the work we do. And then we will conclude with a conversation between a curator and an artist, Xavier Cortada, who was unable to join us in person. He'll be joining us from Miami. And those of you who saw the Hello project out in the lobby just participated in one of his participatory social works. And for me, the existential threat of climate crisis is that I am actually living at 7.55 feet. And really, Miami has a lot of work to do to prevent this climate crisis from destroying people and community. So I think it's really apt to have this conversation. I didn't want it to be negative. I want it to be how we can take action. And so, in fact, when I wrote the little synopsis for the talk, I wrote that I wanted to begin with this sort of analogy of being in an airplane where they ask you to put on your mask first before you attend to your traveling partner or child. And so we're going to begin today's session with a presentation by Professor Jennifer Atkins, who is joining us virtually from Washington State. And she's the Associate Professor of Environmental Humanities. And she's going to talk to us about building resilience for a climate change future. So I welcome Jennifer Atkinson.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I am logging in to join you from Seattle, Washington, and I want to acknowledge that our city and campus sit on the unceded Sammamish and Duwamish lands and waters, which are part of the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. If you could advance the slide. Actually, if you could go to one more, please. Thank you. So the focus of my talk is going to be a bit different than typical climate or sustainability talks concerned with the external damage of this crisis. What I want to address today is the landscape of damage that we carry inside of us as a result of the unprecedented losses that we face in this age of mass extinction, climate-fueled disasters, disappearing glaciers and communities and ways of life, and the disruption of really the living systems of our planet. When we talk about the emotional and psychological toll of our climate and biodiversity crisis, the most common phrases that you hear to describe it are probably eco-anxiety or climate grief. But our responses involve a really wide range of emotions, guilt, anger, grief, hope, numbness, love, trauma, despair. Advanced slide. Over the past 4 years, there has been an explosion of terms describing these emotional dimensions, along with tons of research on the topic. Eco-anxiety was actually the runner-up for Oxford's Word of the Year in 2019. And another marker of this surge can be seen in Google search terms, where searches for climate anxiety were up 565% last year. Slide. The American Psychological Association has also started to pay attention. It issued a major report a few years back where they defined climate anxiety as a chronic fear of environmental doom. Slide. You also see terms like climate trauma, pre-traumatic stress, global dread. I always cite the definition of science writer Britt Ray, who wrote, quote, "At its simplest, at this late stage in the climate crisis, eco-anxiety is merely a sign of attachment to the world." And I myself became interested in this topic partly because of my direct experience of the endless wildfires in California, which is where I grew up and still spend a lot of time with family who have been directly impacted and had to flee fires burning right outside their front door. Slide. But the most powerful force in directing my attention to this emotional toll was just seeing its impact on my students and the young people that I work with. These are some quotes from the first day of one of my classes at the University of Washington when I asked students how they felt about the future. This was just from about 6 or 7 weeks ago. You'll see, I feel hopeless, useless, and minuscule. Why even bother bringing children into an already dying world? Whirlwind of despair, overwhelmed by grief and anxiety. There's one, seeing the planet break down has made me break down. And on and on. And of course, it's not just university students in the US having these reactions. This is a global phenomenon. Slide. Just last fall, the largest research study ever done on mental health impacts of climate change for young people showed that it's causing pretty profound psychological distress. So this research is based on surveys of more than 10,000 teens from across the world. The surveys included Australia, Brazil, India, Nigeria, Finland, the Philippines, the US. 56% of youth think that humanity is doomed. 1 in 4 are afraid of having children, and 77% say that the future is frightening with regard to climate change. So this emotional harm is a matter of intergenerational inequality. Slide. It's also a matter of racial and economic inequality. So in the responses published in that study, concern about climate change was concentrated much more heavily in poorer countries and communities of color, the very people who've contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions wrecking the planet. And yet they're the ones suffering the heaviest climate impacts and therefore the highest emotional toll. So for example, in the Philippines, 92% of youth said the future was frightening compared with 68% in the United States. Slide. And then for Indigenous people, traditional hunting and cultural practices are being wiped out by a warming climate. Arctic communities are a really visible example of this, where they can't travel to ancestral sites or hunt in the old ways because the landscape is melting beneath them. Suicide has risen among those groups as well. This makes climate change really a quintessential example of what's meant in identifying something as an existential threat. It's a threat not only to life and the survival of these communities, but also to their identity, their culture, their entire way of being in the world. Slide. So for all these reasons, the current experience of climate injustice is magnifying past and ongoing traumas for colonized people. Nyla Burton has a powerful article on this, and I put the title up on this slide because I think it's an important one if you do any follow-up reading after today. I also included a link to it on the resources page of my website, which I'll share at the end. This is where climate grief and anxiety really surface the dynamics of unequal risks and burdens. Of course, Black and Brown and Indigenous communities have pointed out that they've had to face the prospect of an unlivable future long before climate change, and that white folks now struggling with climate anxiety are simply having their first experience of existential threat, which just underscores how insulated we've been up to this point. So that's just a very brief and very partial overview of how this is playing out. Slide. My main purpose today is really to share a couple thoughts about how we might reimagine our relationship with climate anxiety and grief. So I'm going to dive into that question by reading a 3-minute excerpt from a podcast I created called Facing It, which explores how dark emotions like grief might actually be a doorway to something powerful that we've forgotten in this whole conversation about climate change. And in this particular excerpt, I'm reflecting on the course I designed at the University of Washington to help students cope with climate grief. And what I found when I walked into the class that first day was a room full of students who saw grief as a problem to be solved and wanted me to help make it go away. And that really enabled me to recognize a misunderstanding that I'd been carrying around as well. Slide. This is an art project from one of my students on the slide. When I first launched my seminar on eco-grief, I was every bit as distressed as my students and looking for ways to extinguish my pain for all this suffering. But something unexpected happened along the way. I had always thought of grief as a bad thing, a dark state to avoid or overcome as quickly as possible. I thought that feeling grief was like succumbing to a preventable illness, or that once it took hold, I might fall into a bottomless hole of despair. Slide. But in time, it dawned on us that maybe we were seeking solutions to the wrong problem. We all wanted to fix the way we felt so we could go back to feeling happy. But grief isn't something to be fixed because it's not dysfunctional. In fact, it's a healthy and necessary process we have to undergo in order to heal. Slide. First, grief isn't just one of many options for accepting loss. Grief is the process of accepting loss. I get why many people working towards sustainability want to sidestep emotional issues and push the public straight into action. The situation is urgent, and dwelling on our feelings can seem like an extravagance as the fires close in. But the problem is when we try to jump straight to the final step without first processing all of this lost beauty in life, we're bypassing the very insights that motivate us to fight for our world in the first place. Slide. Ignoring ecological grief is like trying to rush through any great loss, a job, a home, someone you love, without pausing to acknowledge what you're leaving behind. In all of those cases, we're not just losing something we once had, we're also losing the future that many of us had counted on. Slide. Denial isn't just a description for people who reject the science. It describes university professors like me and scientists studying climate change and activists fighting to keep things from getting worse. We understand the problem intellectually, but we don't live as though we do. We accept the facts, but we haven't felt our way through what those facts mean, how our lives, how all lives will be undone in some way. We can't act creatively and honestly in this new reality until we mourn the passing of the old one. And all the ancient wisdom traditions affirm this truth, that grief is not here to take us hostage. It is the agent needed to transform us so that we can confront a similarly transformed world. Slide. But as the podcast series progresses, I try to push beyond just reframing grief as something that's not bad, to also consider ways that it is actively good. Grief arises from love and deep attachment. You will not grieve for something you don't love. It's a way of honoring our connection and empathy with other species or people. When we feel that pain, we remember that our existence and well-being are deeply entwined with other lives. A slide. I'm really drawn to this quote by Malkia Devich-Cyril, who wrote, "Joy is not the opposite of grief. Grief is the opposite of indifference. Grief is an evolutionary indicator of love, the kind of great love that guides revolutionaries." And I think recognizing this is essential for my own students and other climate activists who've internalized the assumption that grief leads to inaction. We live in such a grief-phobic culture where the moment that you say that word, the image that comes to mind is someone who can't get out of bed because they're immobilized by pain, someone who is depleted rather than actually being driven by that passion out in the community, creating change. And so that really, I think, undercuts the middle ground that we need in this moment between naive and blind hope on one hand and pure despair on the other. I think that binary mindset that splits our emotional responses into these two mutually exclusive categories has probably contributed significantly to the rise of climate doomism as well. Slide. I'm sure you've all heard this term of a climate doomer. Doomers do acknowledge and embrace grief, but they misunderstand it as an excuse for inaction. So they see grief as an endpoint rather than a doorway, as Margaret Klein Solomon so beautifully put it. But when we recognize that grief as an outgrowth of love, we remember its radical potential, because there's really no emotion that's more powerful than love in motivating us to fight. And research has confirmed this. It's more effective than fear and anger and all the rest. There's no limit to how long people will stay engaged or how deeply they'll invest themselves when they are motivated by love. And of course, fear can be really good at mobilizing action at the outset, but we have to remember that we are going to be doing this work for the rest of our lives. And fear and anger lead to burnout quite quickly. And so we have to ask ourselves if that's a sustainable strategy over the long haul. Slide. I also want to make the argument that grief is a political act, because it challenges artificial boundaries that we create between ourselves and other species, as well as other humans. And this is where I think that the arts come into the conversation about climate change in a very powerful way. We live in a culture where some lives matter and others don't. Some deaths receive elaborate tributes and mourning rituals, while others are trivialized or ignored. And of course, groups like Black Lives Matter, people seeking justice for murdered Indigenous women and trans and homeless and LGBTQ activists know firsthand how this absence of public grief dehumanizes them, which is why they deliberately use public protests and vigils to ensure that those deaths aren't pushed into the shadows. Slide. When it comes to climate grief or ecological grief, this can be a challenge because our culture doesn't really have any established norms for recognizing or mourning the loss of nature. Mourning is fundamentally a social process. And we understand this when it comes to familiar norms around the death of a person. People who lose a loved one can turn to social rituals like funerals and vigils and memorials, even just the basic everyday practices like sending sympathy cards. And it's the social nature of those rituals that validates our pain and removes our isolation from others, which again is healing in itself. But if you feel grief for the disappearance of snow on the mountains or the death of animals in a wildfire or just visual access to the sky, there really aren't any established social structures to acknowledge it. So this is what's known as disenfranchised grief, a kind of pain that is essentially made invisible, which deepens the harm that we experience. Slide. So for today, I was thinking of ways that folks in the arts and arts activism are embracing mourning as a way to counter that disenfranchised grief and bring visibility to losses that otherwise go unacknowledged. One example is Remembrance Day for Lost Species, which has grown into a worldwide movement of community events commemorating the extinct species. And on this slide, you see mourners carrying a replica of the world's last passenger pigeon to be burned on a funeral pyre. The other image is a processional for the great auk, which was driven to extinction in the 1880s. Slide. This other piece also is depicting the annihilation of the passenger pigeon as the tide rises over the stand. Slide. Extinction Rebellion is another group that uses funeral symbolism like coffins and mourning processionals in its activism. Slide. Another well-known figure from the arts who's tackled the issue of eco-grief head-on is Chris Jordan. He's talked very openly about falling into depression after a multi-year project of documenting the death of albatross from plastic pollution and how he dove into his own arts practice as a kind of healing ritual. So in this photo, he's transformed that ingested plastic, the same material that killed these birds, into these mandalas that are essentially a memorial to them and a visual protest against mass consumption and waste. Let's go 2 slides forward. Thank you. The last example, this is one that got some interesting media attention about 2 summers ago when Icelanders held a memorial service and installed a plaque commemorating the first glacier lost to climate change in their country. And in a culture like ours, where Jeremy Hance has pointed out, he's called our culture death phobic and grief illiterate. That certainly makes these kinds of practices especially cathartic, really allowing an intense feelings of safe release through ritual. And their collective nature in itself removes isolation from other mourners, which helps shake us from that mass denial. Slide. So normally in a longer talk, I'd have time to walk you through all of these 5 steps for managing climate despair. But since I can't cover everything today, I just want to skip straight to the last point. And if you'd like to learn about the others, you can find a full discussion in my podcast or on my website. But this final point is really a culmination of all the others. That, taking action is the most powerful antidote to despair. And it's the answer that I usually give when people ask me, and I always get this question in the Q&A, like, how do you maintain hope? And what I say is, don't get hung up on cultivating hope. Hope is the natural outcome of doing the work. Slide. Diego Arguedas Ortiz is a Costa Rican climate writer who's addressed this issue in a really powerful essay where he said, real, good, useful hope has nothing to do with positive news. Instead, it is profoundly linked with action, both ours and that of others alongside us. There's only one way to earn hope, and that's rolling up our sleeves. And I think it's really helpful here to think of hope as something we earn or something we do rather than something we just get to have. Slide. And that's not because of some naive belief that one person planting trees or going to a climate march is going to solve the problem. The real power of collective action is that it helps us build solidarity. And cognitive psychologists repeatedly emphasize the importance of imagining ourselves as part of a team, as that has both personal and practical benefits. On a personal level, that community or team-based approach helps address the existential loneliness that many people are already feeling in this moment. A lot of times, the source of our despair isn't the crisis itself so much as a longing for fellowship or the absence of a sense of purpose in the midst of difficulty. And that sense of purpose that we crave can actually be deepened through adversity. There is great joy and often a sense of adventure in knowing that you're part of a historic movement that's rising up to confront the greatest challenge and injustice of your time. And then on a practical level, collective action counteracts that nagging suspicion that our individual actions are really too insignificant to matter, which is for the most part true. I mean, you alone riding your bike or becoming a vegan is not going to solve this. And many people know now that, BP invented the carbon footprint calculator, right? They want us to sort of turn our attention towards our individual actions rather than systemic change and political movements. Slide. And so that mentality really leads people to throw up their hands and say, why even bother? If any personal act just gets dwarfed by the scale of the crisis. It's a very American or Western individualistic response. And again, one that the fossil fuel industry loves to perpetuate. But if we see ourselves as working collectively rather than individually, then we can recognize that all contributions sync up with a larger network of change. This is what Adrienne Marie Brown calls emergent strategy, a movement that spirals out from all kinds of small and local actions and connections to create much more complex systems and larger systemic change. Slide. So in terms of the climate crisis, the really good news is that the solution to the existential loneliness many of us feel is the same solution to climate change, right? Because they both boil down to solidarity and collective action. So if you want to find some of those opportunities for connections, I would invite you to go to the resources page of my website listed here. I've listed a number of groups that meet virtually or in person to host these discussions and build community around eco-anxiety and the endless ways that people can get engaged in solutions in their own communities. Slide. And in terms of books for further reading on the topic, these are some of my favorites. They're certainly the ones that have most informed my research and presentation. So I also want to acknowledge my colleagues and friends here who have written these and done this research. And if you want to connect with me on social media, I try to post new talks and workshops and podcasts, as well as articles and material on this topic. I use Instagram more than Twitter these days, so but I'd be delighted if you'd connect with me. So thank you so much for letting me join your session this morning. And I know there might be a couple minutes left over here for a question or two.
Thank you very much for that informative talk. My question has to do with, you were described as a professor of environmental humanities. Can you just give us a mini history of the way that professorships have changed? Because I'm thinking back to the day when there was a geologist and an oceanographer, but now it seems like we're mixing fields. And could you just explain that further? Thank you.
Yeah, so I work in a very interdisciplinary program, which is more, I guess, sort of problem-based. So students would be presented, let's take something like climate change, rather than sort of narrowly focusing on one discipline as a way to understand that problem. We are really drawing from the sciences, from the arts, from literature, from the social sciences. But I think the reason that your question is so important is that, traditionally, the rhetoric that we have used and the framework that we have used to talk about climate change has been through the sciences. We've been doing this for 30 years. And the science has been well established on climate change for 3 decades. And yet we have made such inadequate progress. And I think that part of the reason for that is because, and this is not at all to discredit the great work that scientists have done, but the nature of their discourse is to exclude these subjective elements. They're not asking the philosophical or existential questions, right? It's using numbers, data, charts, and statistics to represent the problem. And so that has allowed people, I think, very much to kind of compartmentalize the problem and think, well, this is a problem for the sciences to solve, and not really do the kind of deeper work of imagining how we got here, thinking about our value systems, thinking about the ways that that history, that structures of inequality, that our political systems, our systems of culture and representation, and the arts, and all of these other things are bound up both in the problem that we face and in the solutions that we need to it. And I think, the last thing I would just say is I think one of the most important sort of ways forward from here lies in storytelling. The kinds of stories that we tell, not just through narrative, but through the visual arts and in every other way in our lives. And the dominant genre we have used to talk about the future is the genre of apocalypse when we talk about climate change. So we need different stories, we need different images to think about a climate changed future in which we can actually thrive, in which we can embrace and restore and rejuvenate life. And so I think of all of us in many ways as storytellers that need to sort of pick up that project and move forward from here now in ways that probably the physical sciences are not necessarily equipped to do. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Jennifer. This is Mary Ann. We appreciate you joining us so early in the morning from Washington State. And I hope you'll continue to listen in. And we're going to move on to our panel.